All right, once again, my name is Jake Marcinko, and I am a Senior Technical Product Manager for the PCI Security Standards Council. In addition to my responsibilities over software, key management, and car production, I'm also one of the internal champions for driving the PCI SSC Standard Modernization Initiative. So during today's session, what we want to do is we want to explain what the standards modernization effort is, why it's important, and what we hope to achieve through this effort. But before we can really address these questions, we need to explain how the PCI SSC's so-called sausage is made. In other words, we need to explain the process for how standards and their supporting documentation are brought to market. So this represents any generic PCI SSC standard. And standards have to go through quite a few steps before they're published. Now, PCI SSC standards and guidance generally originates from within a PCI working group. The working groups develop or refine an internal draft of the standard until they reach a consensus on a version that they feel is suitable for soliciting industry feedback via the RFC process. Once the standard has received internal approval to go to RFC, the draft documents are then shared with participating organizations like yourselves and other key stakeholder groups through the PCI portal. These groups then provide their feedback and ideas on the draft standards back to PCI SSC. We then collate this information and submit it to the working group. The working groups then collectively review the feedback, and they consider whether and or how to incorporate the feedback into a subsequent revised draft. This whole process repeats itself until the working group is ready with a version that they're comfortable with publishing. But again, before a standard can be published, it must go through a series of internal approvals. And if approved by the internal PCI stakeholders, the standard is then published to the PCI SSC website. So now that you understand the general process of how a new standard and guidance are brought to market, let's look at some of the specific ingredients that go into producing a PCI standard. So most standards start out as Microsoft Word documents. They are then converted into PDF format before being submitted to RFC or for internal approval to publish to the PCI SSC website. This is a common method that not just PCI SSC has used, but other standards bodies like ISO, et cetera, have used for years, or for decades, really. But this approach does present some challenges. One such challenge is data loss during the conversion process from Microsoft Word to PDF. Now, converting from proprietary formats sometimes results in content loss or unintended content transformation. Things like headers, footers, fonts, and other formatting elements do not always convert well. While the loss of certain formatting elements may not seem like a big problem, the loss of semantic enrichment elements like bookmarks, hyperlinks, footnotes are much more problematic. The second issue is usability. And within the usability category, there are really two primary issues with our standards or with standards from a usability perspective. That's accessibility and interpretability. Now, there's one page in PCI DSS version 4.0.1 that I think illustrates these issues perfectly. How many people are familiar with this page? Let's just see a number of folks. This is an excellent example of semantically enriching the document. This page provides context for what each section within the standard and requirement is intended to do. So with contextual information and metadata to really improve your understanding of the requirements. However, there are some issues with the way that this information is presented. Let's look at some specific examples. First, our standards generally assume humans are the only users of our standards. Now, with increased adoption of automation and AI, this is no longer a reasonable assumption. Computers often struggle to process interpreted information such as images. And applying metadata concepts described in this page to the rest of the document may be challenging for computers. This page is also challenging for human users with disabilities. For example, notice that there's some minor color variations within the page. People with color blindness may not be able to differentiate between these minor color variations or be able to process what these colors mean. Additionally, this is a fairly complex layout. Use of complex or high-density layouts are very tough for people with autism or dyslexia to process. Additionally, users with dyslexia struggle to remember things from previous pages and apply them to other sections within the document. So what's the solution? Writing the documentation in XML. However, not all content authors can write or can know how to write documentation natively in XML. So what we're doing currently is we are evaluating ways to leverage things like tools or scripts to be able to extract information out of the Word version to construct XML, or using tools to simultaneously generate XML from authoring platforms without requiring standards authors to write XML natively. Now, once we have an XML source document, we can then convert the XML to other formats with limited to no data loss. Now, this is achievable because we're using an open machine-readable format as the source file instead of a proprietary format. This then paves the way for us to do a lot more things than we've historically been able to, such as streamlining or automating our own publication process, or doing things like improving support for accessibility features, making our documentations more interactive, doing translations and localization much easier. So what are we doing today about this? Well, we are currently in the process of analyzing the semantic content within PCI DSS version 4. And we're mapping that content to a set of semantic or custom XML tags that we are then using to create an initial XML version of PCI DSS version 4.0.1. Now, yes, we are using a custom XML schema, and I know that there are other XML schemas out there that are standardized XML schemas from organizations like NISO. The reason why we're using a custom XML schema is to effectively set a baseline for all of our PCI SSC standards, for then evaluating and documenting the contextual structure of those documents. Then from there, we can map and convert to any other XML or JSON schema of choice, such as the NISO STS, the NIST OSCAL format, or Cyclone DX, for example. Now, our current timelines are divided into 3 distinct phases. We are currently in an initial pilot phase using PCI DSS version 4 and our custom XML schema. Phase 2, we will be expanding the use of the XML schema to support other standards and document types, including AOCs and ROCs. We will be producing XML versions of those documents as well. Then in phase 3, we'll look at expanding and supporting the use of other XML schemas like the ones I mentioned before. Now, this slide obviously shows us having 3 distinct phases. We are likely to add additional phases as we start rolling out these processes to other standards and documentation. And these timelines are, as always, are subject to change. So if you have any questions, suggestions for us, comments, please send them about this initiative. Please send them to this email address. Myself and several others get those emails, or come talk to me during this community meeting. We'd love to get your feedback, your thoughts, your recommendations on how we might be able to go about this effectively, how we can support your business needs. And we'll respond to those questions if you send them via email as quickly as we can. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, everyone.